Welcome to a three-part series called Orwell Today. In this series we'll be looking at nationalism and the Labour Party and their defeat in a 2019 general election. The aim of this series is not to tear apart one movement or another in the sake of my own personal political motives. As you should read on, this will go counter to the ideas being raised and would be ironic, but instead I aim to show you the state of nationalist tendencies in Britain 75 years after Orwell wrote his Notes on Nationalism. Notes on Nationalism is a work that I feel is fundamental to understanding the socio-political feelings of contemporary Britain, its establishments and its followers. I will, as the title says, focus on the Labour Party, as due to their defeat in the recent election they have given me much content to focus on. I'm sure one could do the same for the Conservatives, using a similar format if one so chooses. Orwell's writings may be key for us to understand the polarity in our modern society, and once knowing the issue we may know how to fix it. However, this book has been published for 3/4 of a century and no cure has been found, so I would not be optimistic but insightful. Basics of nationalism. In this first section I will give you Orwell's basic definitions of nationalistic types and aim to give modern examples. Our first quote from Notes on Nationalism is, "By nationalism, I mean first of all, the habit of assuming that human beings can be classified like insects and that whole blocks of millions or tens of millions of people can be labelled as good or bad. The classification of people here, I believe, means to collectivise people into singular groups, or as Orwell will go on to refer them as, units. We are not individuals, but mere insects to a hive to progress the colony. In essence, this means to be identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil and recognising no other duty than that of advancing its interests. The colony is all that matters and all that comes from it. An example we may see is at the issue of Brexit, that there was evidence to say that Jeremy Corbyn, the ex-Labour leader, had anti-EU sentiments. But due to the Labour Party taking a Remain stance, he relieved himself of this view. He relinquished his individual thought for that of advancing the interests of the party, or his unit. It is clear that we should make a distinction between nationalism and patriotism. We will explore nationalism in further depth later on, but for patriotism, George Orwell writes, "Patriotism, I mean devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world but has no wish to force upon other people. Patriotism is of its nature defensive, both militarily and culturally." A few years back the BBC did a study into patriotism in the UK, but I believe they missed the mark and really studied nationalistic views. They asked people how much they believed to either be English, British, both or neither. However, I believe what Orwell is getting at here is even more local and even more abstract. A patriot is someone who is in tune with their community, the people they surround themselves with on a daily basis. They also have ideas of how they see an ideal Brit or a typical Englishman, but they would never subject anyone to need to be one. Instead of loving one's nations for nation's sake, they instead love the values that the nation and community hold and what it has produced as a consequence, and would serve to protect those values. For instance, in that BBC study, they note that the English flag has become a racist symbol because of racist figures charting it, meaning that the common patriot associates the values that they hold to it, but may be ashamed to fly the flag for the mere fear that they impose themselves on others. Flags are peculiar because one could argue they are both a nationalist symbol but also a patriotic symbol, and we will establish more on flags and symbolism when we reach the nomenclature arguments of nationalism in the next part. In a return to the ideas of nationalism, the prevailing distinction between patriotism to nationalism is that nationalism is inseparable from the desire for power, as well as the abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation or other unit in which he has chosen to sink his own individuality. Power, prestige, and individualism. In this sense, power is a form of control. Whether that be through government, cultural, or ideological influence, it is dependent on the aims of those who wish to further their unit. Prestige, however, is the arrogance a nationalist gets to claim over other units, or even failing that, the prestige of others whom they associate. This can be evidenced whenever the phrase "this is a win for" is made. An example is when Maduro Chavez won power in 2013 for socialism in Venezuela. Corbyn was one of the first to praise this on behalf of the poor. This was not his win, but one he felt he could see prestige in the socialist unit's favour. Individualism here I can refer back to the insect metaphor. When one gives up their individual thoughts for those of the unit, they are susceptible to nationalism. Orwell furthers this point by noting that in nationalism it does not necessarily mean loyalty to a government or a country, still less to one's own country. It is not even strictly necessary that the unit in which it deals should actually exist. Socialism does not need to exist in a country for figures such as Corbyn to have loyalty to it. Nationalism on any ground can be referred to almost as an ideological possession, one similar to the ideas of Carl Jung. With a closer look at prestige, we will dissect ideas of nationalism, Brexit and the intelligentsia. It is key not to confuse nationalism with mere worship of success, as one can be happy or angry about a political event or movement and not be a nationalist. The media and modern intelligentsia, however, would frame this otherwise, as the definitions used by them are not the same as we are speaking of here. Instead, they would define Brexit as nationalism against globalism. This misconstrues the ideas that we are speaking of, as one could have voted in favour of Brexit and not have been a nationalist, whilst one could have been a Remainer and also be a nationalist. When I speak of the intelligentsia, I mean the academics in the humanities and the sociological departments. An example of which is upon a quick Google search of Brexit nationalism. The first suggested academic book by Google is Brexit, Sociological Responses, and we open to Craig Calhoun's response that Brexit is ultimately a vote against London, globalism and multiculturalism as much as a vote against Europe. To which he later associates, it is partially similar popularism, nationalism and indeed authoritarianism. After almost 4 years of studying under the intelligentsia, one might conclude that I am as much in the same pot as Calhoun. I do disregard this. The modern academics are as nationalist as in the time of Orwell, and they have been corrupted by the abstract thoughts of wokeism, meaning an overemphasis on inclusivity and diversity, whilst a loose rejection of racism and fascism. It is writers such as Calhoun which will aim to push the unit of diversity and globalism whilst denigrating units of thought which go against this. This ideological corruption is not suited for the institutions of open-mindedness. What is ironic is that from his statement that Brexit is to gain authoritarianism, those who may be a nationalist on the side of Brexit claim otherwise, that it is a pull away from the authoritarian state of the EU. The rhetoric that Brexit is England against London further emphasises there is an ideological bubble the intelligentsia lives in, away from the struggles of ordinary citizens, and would cry that their unit is under attack. In this section I will talk more anecdotally about the intelligentsia in which I have studied under and Orwell's writings of the intelligentsia. This is a move somewhat away from nationalism as its basic definitions, but one I feel should be included. I will add a timestamp in the bottom if one would wish to skip this, however I do think it adds to the causes in which I'm talking about on the modern day emphasis. Orwell writes on the intelligentsia that in 1945, as the English intelligentsia, for those who feel deeply about contemporary politics, certain topics have become so infected by considerations of prestige that a genuinely rational approach to them is almost impossible. This is where I claim that wokeness has become a topic that cannot be disputed under the humanities. In one lecture there was a discussion about the political economy of representation in the media industries. The lecturer noted we must have more black writers in the process in order to see an increase in BAME, black and Asian minority ethnic, in not only the process but in the content. To this I retorted that instead we must have a blindness to race. Instead we must judge on the merit one has for the role of being an actor or a writer, following the lines of Martin Luther King, that we must judge on content of character. This was met with a sneer of, "We will see if you still believe that in a few weeks. I have not changed my opinion." But the mere fact that this idea was not met with rationality, but instead a confidence that I too would become possessed in the ideas that they held, gave me little hope, and it continues to do so. For those of you who wish to look more into this area of culture, I would suggest looking at Andrew Doyle. He is a writer and comedian who is taking a stance against woke culture and can word the movement in better terms than I. In relation to what I'm about to make, some may say it is a narrative bordering on cultural Marxism. But, as according to Orwell, among intelligentsia, it hardly needs saying that the dominant form of nationalism is communism, using this word in a very loose sense to include not merely Communist Party members, but fellow travellers and Russophiles generally. In the past few years, the woke ideology has been revealed because of figures such as Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who in 2016 was faced against the institutions themselves for not wishing to comply to the ideals he did not agree with. This is to say that not all lecturers are woke nationalists, but they can ascribe to the ideas that are distributed from them, such as infringements on free speech, which ultimately impinges on free thought. It is commonplace for units to have contradictory opinions, as one would expect the university to be a place of free expression, but as long as it does not go against the prevailing orthodoxy. This, however, is not where it ends for free speech at universities. In 2019, King's College London, it was found that students that held conservative views felt reluctant to express themselves freely, a fifth believing free speech is under attack in the institution, but half believing it to be a countrywide issue. The universities are slipping into nationalism, but for a single ideal of progressive woke culture. It may sound ironic, but I do believe this to be the issue, that when a society does not have the ability to speak against nationalism, whether that be through enforced means or fear of social repercussions because of social temperament, totalitarian structures rise, as did happen in Nazi Germany. What is ironic is that the progressive cultures in the West are an overcorrection to the ideas of Nazi Germany. So to compare them does seem ironic on the face of it, but they use some similar modes. For example, it is wrong to question woke ideology. I'm assuming that in the 30s in Nazi Germany, if you were to question Nazi propaganda, you were not a true patriot to your country, or you might have been a spy. But in the modern day, to say that you do not care for feminism or race issues means you are a misogynist or a racist. Their aim is not to win an argument, but to have you fear criticising the ideas. In Notes on Nationalism, George Orwell talks a lot about G.K. Chesterton, a man who on one front held singular views for the nation, but on an international sense had completely varying and opposite views. The reader is taken on an adventure as to how one could hold such views in such different senses. Chesterton had extremely contradictory opinions, and the same could be said for many of the opinions of the Labour Party prior to 2020. After Jeremy Corbyn stepped down, there's been a bid for who will become the next leader. One of the core values of Labour has always been for the working classes. It is a socialist party, but at the same time it works against those people it stands for. In an interview with Andrew McNeil, Emily Thornberry has had to face a video in which she sits with Dawn Butler, that there is something wrong with you if you voted Brexit. And Thornberry says nothing against this. The issue with this is that the majority of people who voted Brexit were working class, minimally educated people from generally the north of England and outside of London. To stand and say in your home policy that you aim to help these people, but on your international issues you go against them, is comical and was ultimately the downfall of Labour in 2019 for abandoning their base. It is common for a nationalist to forsake his principles without even noticing that he was doing so. Chesterton may have passed from this world, but his hypocrisy that lies within a nationalist is eternal.